Hey guys, tonight we're stepping aboard the creaking wooden deck of the Santa Maria in October 1492, where the salt spray stings your face and the endless Atlantic stretches beyond every horizon. You're about to experience 24 hours in the life of a sailor following Christopher Columbus into the complete unknown. No GPS, no weather forecasts, no idea if you'll ever see home again. You're surrounded by men who smell like they haven't bathed since leaving Spain, eating food that's already going bad. And oh yeah, you probably won't survive this voyage, because half the crew on these early expeditions never made it back to tell their tales. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first pale light of dawn creeps across the horizon, and you're already awake, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. Your watch duty began at 4 a.m, which the crew calls the wolf hour, that dead time when exhaustion weighs heaviest on your shoulders, and every shadow on the water looks like a sea monster. You've been standing at your post for nearly an hour, gripping the rough wooden railing as the ship rocks beneath your feet with that endless, hypnotic rhythm that's become the soundtrack of your existence. The Santa Maria is the largest of Columbus's 3 ships, but large is relative when you're talking about a vessel that's barely 90 feet long and 25 feet wide. You're crammed aboard with 39 other souls, and right now, in these quiet moments before the day begins, you can hear them all snoring, coughing, muttering prayers in their sleep. The ship itself creaks and groans like a living thing, its timbers stressed by every wave that passes beneath the hull. Your job during the dawn watch is simple in theory, but nerve-wracking in practice. Scan the horizon for any signs of land, other ships, or danger. Columbus has been promising land for weeks now, and the crew's patience is wearing thinner than the ship's already patched sails. You squint through the morning mist, hoping to be the one who spots the coastline that will make you all rich and famous. Instead, you see nothing but water stretching to infinity, broken only by the occasional dolphin pod or flying fish that startles you by bursting from the waves. Historical record shows that Columbus's crew was paid in advance for their journey, with ordinary seamen receiving about 1,000 maravedis per month, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's wages back in Spain. But here's the quirky part. Columbus promised additional rewards for the first person to spot land, including a silk jacket and an annual pension of 10,000 maravedis. That's like promising someone a luxury car and a comfortable retirement just for having good eyesight, which explains why every sailor aboard spent countless hours staring at the horizon with desperate intensity. As the sun climbs higher, you notice Columbus himself emerging from his small cabin. The man who convinced the Spanish crown to fund this impossible journey doesn't look particularly impressive in the morning light. He's around 41 years old, prematurely gray hair, and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life on the sea. Historians still argue whether Columbus was a visionary genius or a lucky fool, but standing here on his deck, watching him check the compass and study the wind patterns, you can't help but admire his absolute confidence in the face of the unknown. The morning air carries strange scents, not the familiar smells of European ports, but something different, something that makes your nose twitch with anticipation. Some of the crew swear they can smell land in the wind, though it might just be wishful thinking mixed with the perpetual stench of the ship's bilge. You've learned to identify the ship's many odors. The tar used to seal the planks, the vinegar that preserves what's left of the food, the unwashed bodies of men who have been at sea for over a month, and underneath it all, the clean, endless smell of the ocean itself. Your watch partner, a grizzled sailor named Miguel who's been to sea since he was 12, nudges you and points toward the water. "Look there," he whispers, "the color's changing." You follow his gaze and notice he's right. The deep blue of the open ocean is giving way to a slightly different shade. It's the kind of subtle change that only experienced sailors notice, but it could mean you're approaching shallower water, which could mean land is near. Or it could mean nothing at all, just another false hope in a journey built on them. As the sun fully rises, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would be beautiful if you weren't so terrified of what each new day might bring, you hear the ship's bell calling the crew to morning prayers. Your watch is nearly over, and soon you'll join the others in the daily ritual that keeps morale from completely collapsing. But for now, you take one last look at the horizon, hoping against hope that today will be the day everything changes. The ship's bell continues its insistent clanging, and you abandon your post to join the gathering crowd on the main deck. Morning prayers aren't optional aboard Columbus's ship. They're as mandatory as breathing, and probably more important for survival, according to the deeply religious crew. You squeeze between your fellow sailors, all of whom look as tired and unwashed as you feel, their faces bearing the particular exhaustion that comes from sleeping on hard wood while the world rocks beneath you. Columbus himself leads the prayers, his voice carrying across the deck with the authority of someone who genuinely believes God has chosen him for this mission. The crew joins in reciting the Pater Noster and Ave Maria, their voices mixing with the sound of wind in the rigging and waves against the hull. You mumble along, though your mind wanders to more practical concerns, like whether you'll get enough food today to quiet the constant gnawing in your stomach. The Catholic Church played a massive role in Columbus's voyage, with the expedition officially framed as a mission to spread Christianity to whatever lands they might discover. Columbus carried a letter from the Spanish monarchs addressed to the Grand Khan of China, whom they fully expected to encounter, requesting permission to establish trade relations and convert the local population. Of course, the Grand Khan had been dead for over 2 centuries by then, but geography wasn't exactly a strong suit in 15th century Europe. After prayers, you line up for your morning ration, which consists of a piece of hardtack, ship's biscuit, that that's already developing an impressive collection of weevils, and a small portion of wine mixed with water. The hardtack is so hard you have to soak it in the wine mixture to make it remotely edible, and even then it tastes like salted cardboard. The wine, thankfully, helps kill some of the bacteria in the water, though it's been watered down so much that calling it wine is generous. Here's where things get interesting from a historical perspective. Columbus's crew was actually eating better than most European peasants of the time. Their daily rations included not just hardtack and wine, but also salt pork, dried legumes, olive oil, vinegar, and cheese. The problem was preservation. After weeks at sea, the salt pork was turning rancid. The cheese was growing creative varieties of mold, and the olive oil had developed a taste that could charitably be described as oceanic. You sit cross-legged on the deck with your breakfast, watching Columbus consult with his officers about the day's course. The man has an almost supernatural ability to project confidence, even when you can see the worry lines around his eyes. He's been promising land for days now, showing the crew various signs that indicate they're close to their destination. Changes in the water color, unfamiliar birds flying overhead, pieces of carved wood floating past that could have come from inhabited shores. The conversation around you inevitably turns to food, because that's what hungry people talk about. Your shipmate Antonio, a young sailor from Seville, describes in loving detail the meal he's going to eat when he gets home. Fresh bread, roasted chicken, wine that hasn't been mixed with questionable water, and vegetables that aren't pickled beyond recognition. Another sailor, Pedro, counters with his own fantasy feast, complete with honey cakes and fresh fruit. It's torture, but the kind of torture that somehow makes you feel more human. Historians still argue whether Columbus actually believed he would reach Asia by sailing west, or if he knew he was likely to encounter unknown lands. His calculations were based on a significantly underestimated circumference of the Earth, combined with an overestimated size of the Asian continent. Either he was terrible at mathematics, or he was deliberately fudging the numbers to make his proposal seem more feasible to his royal sponsors. Either way, you're stuck in the middle of the Atlantic with a man whose navigation skills are questionable at best. The morning routine continues with the crew checking and adjusting the rigging, ensuring that every rope is properly secured and every sail is set to catch the wind efficiently. You participate in this daily ritual, your hands automatically going through the motions of checking knots and testing tension, while your mind remains focused on the horizon. The work is mindless enough that you can think about other things, like the fact that you signed up for this journey expecting to return home wealthy, but you're starting to wonder if you'll return home at all. As the sun climbs higher, the temperature begins to rise, and you can feel the sweat starting to form beneath your woolen shirt. The clothing you're wearing is the same outfit you've been wearing for weeks now. There's no such thing as a change of clothes on a ship this size, and laundry is limited to occasionally rinsing salt water through your garments when the weather permits. You've become intimately familiar with your own smell, and it's not pleasant. The morning prayers and rations ritual serves a purpose beyond mere sustenance and spiritual comfort. It's a way of maintaining order and routine in an environment where both could easily collapse. Columbus understands that keeping his crew focused on familiar activities helps prevent the kind of panic that could lead to mutiny. But you can see the cracks starting to show in some of the men's faces, the way their eyes dart nervously toward the horizon, searching for something, anything, that might indicate they're not sailing toward the edge of the world. After the morning routine, you find yourself assigned to assist Columbus and his pilot, Sancho Ruiz, with the daily navigation tasks. This is both an honor and a source of anxiety. An honor because it means Columbus trusts you enough to be present during the ship's most crucial daily ritual, and a source of anxiety because you get to witness firsthand just how primitive and uncertain their navigation methods really are. Columbus stands at the stern of the ship, holding a compass that looks deceptively simple for something that's supposed to guide you across thousands of miles of open ocean. The compass needle points steadily north, but that's about the only thing you can count on with complete certainty. Everything else is educated guesswork, mathematical calculations based on incomplete information, and what Columbus diplomatically calls the art of seamanship. The process begins with dead reckoning, a method of navigation that sounds exactly as ominous as it is. Columbus records the ship's speed, direction, and travel time to estimate your current position. Speed is measured using a log line, a rope with knots tied at regular intervals that's thrown overboard and allowed to trail behind the ship. By counting how many knots pass through their hands in a specific time period, they can calculate the vessel's speed. It's surprisingly accurate when done correctly, but it requires constant attention and adjustment for factors like wind and current. Here's where the historical record gets interesting. Columbus kept 2 sets of logs during his voyage. The first was his private, accurate log that tracked the ship's actual progress. The second was a false log that he shared with the crew, showing shorter distances traveled each day. His reasoning was that if the crew knew how far they'd actually traveled from Spain, they might panic and demand to turn back. So you're literally following a man who's been lying to you about your location since the journey began, probably not the most comforting thought when you're hundreds of miles from the nearest land. Columbus pulls out his quadrant, a brass instrument that looks like a quarter circle with a plumb line hanging from its center. He's attempting to measure the altitude of the sun above the horizon, which theoretically should tell him your latitude, how far north or south you are from the equator. The problem is that taking accurate readings on a moving ship is nearly impossible, and Columbus's mathematical skills aren't exactly cutting edge. You watch him squint through the instrument, trying to align the sun with the horizon, while the ship rocks beneath his feet. The calculations that follow are a mixture of mathematics, tradition, and what can only be described as hopeful thinking. Columbus uses tables and charts that were compiled by earlier navigators, but many of these are based on incomplete or inaccurate information. The most reliable maps of the time still showed the Atlantic as a relatively narrow body of water, with Asia beginning somewhere around where the Caribbean islands actually exist. You're navigating based on geography that's fundamentally wrong, which explains why Columbus remains convinced he's approaching the Indies. One of the most fascinating aspects of Columbus's navigation is his use of natural signs to supplement his instruments. He points out changes in the watercolor that might indicate shallow areas, unfamiliar birds that could suggest nearby land, and floating debris that might have originated from populated shores. Some of these observations are genuinely useful. Experienced sailors can indeed detect subtle environmental changes that indicate proximity to land. Others are probably wishful thinking, dressed up as scientific observation. Historians still argue whether Columbus was a skilled navigator or simply lucky enough to stumble across the Caribbean. His mathematical calculations were demonstrably wrong. His geographical assumptions were based on outdated information, and his instrument readings were often wildly inaccurate. On the other hand, he successfully guided 3 ships across thousands of miles of open ocean and managed to find his way back to Spain, which suggests some level of competence. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was a competent sailor, working with inadequate tools and information. You help Columbus mark the ship's position on his chart, a hand-drawn map that shows the known coasts of Europe and Africa, then trails off into blank ocean marked with speculation and hope. The map includes legendary islands like Antalya and Cipango, places that may or may not exist, but represent the possibility of land in the vast Atlantic. Columbus makes a small mark indicating your estimated position, though you notice he seems to place it somewhat closer to his expected destination than his calculations might actually justify. The most unnerving part of the navigation process is realizing how much is unknown. Columbus has theories about wind patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal weather changes, but theories are all they are. You're traveling through an environment that no European has ever experienced, facing challenges that no one has successfully overcome before. Every decision about course correction or sail adjustment is based on incomplete information and educated guesswork. As the navigation session concludes, Columbus rolls up his charts and instruments with the same confident air he maintains throughout all his daily activities. He announces the day's course to the crew, speaking as if he knows exactly where you are and where you're going. But you've seen behind the curtain now. You know that Columbus is making this up as he goes along, using the best information available, but ultimately trusting in luck, skill, and divine providence to see you through. The sun reaches its peak, transforming the ship's deck into something resembling a wooden frying pan. You're now experiencing the full force of Atlantic sunshine, with no shade, except for the shadows cast by the sails, and those shadows shift constantly as the ship changes course. The heat radiates up from the deck, planks through your thin-soled shoes, and you can feel sweat starting to soak through your woolen shirt despite the ocean breeze. This is when the real work begins. Ships don't maintain themselves. and the constant stress of wind, waves, and salt water means that something always needs repair, adjustment, or replacement. You're assigned to a crew tasked with mending one of the smaller sails that's developed a tear from the constant strain of catching wind. The work requires you to squat on the hot deck, threading thick needles with hemp thread while trying to keep your balance as the ship rolls from side to side. The needle is roughly the size of a small dagger, and the thread is coarse enough to cut your fingers if you're not careful. You're sewing a patch over a rip that's about 2 feet long, using a double running stitch that's designed to hold under the tremendous stress of a sail full of wind. It's precision work that requires concentration, but the heat makes it difficult to focus, and the constant motion of the ship makes it challenging to maintain the steady rhythm necessary for good needlework. Round you, other crew members are engaged in their own maintenance tasks. Some are scrubbing the deck with brushes and salt water, trying to remove the accumulated grime and salt deposits that threaten to make the wooden planks slippery and dangerous. Others are checking the rigging, examining every rope and pulley for signs of wear that could lead to catastrophic failure. The ship's carpenter is working on replacing several deck boards that have begun to rot from constant exposure to salt water and sun. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Columbus's ships were constructed using a technique called Mediterranean carvel planking, where the hull planks were fitted edge to edge and secured with iron nails. This was considered advanced shipbuilding technology for its time, but it also meant that the ships were constantly taking on water through the gaps between planks. The crew had to operate pumps regularly to keep the bilge from filling up, and you can hear the rhythmic sound of pumping throughout the day as someone maintains this essential task. The work is exhausting under the best circumstances, but the midday heat makes it nearly unbearable. You find yourself taking frequent breaks to drink from the water barrel, though the water has a stale, wooden taste that's been made worse by weeks of storage. The vinegar added to prevent bacterial growth gives it a sharp bite that makes your mouth pucker, but it's better than the alternative of drinking contaminated water that could leave you too sick to work. Your fellow sailors have developed various strategies for dealing with the heat. Some have rigged up temporary shade using spare pieces of canvas, creating small pockets of relief where they can work on detailed tasks. Others have stripped down to their undergarments, despite the risk of sunburn, preferring the immediate relief of cooler clothing to the long-term consequences of sun exposure. A few of the more experienced sailors have learned to work in the shadows cast by the sails, timing their movements to stay in the cooler areas as the shadows shift throughout the day. The ship's cook, a perpetually grumpy man named Garsha, is struggling with his own heat-related challenges. The cooking area is located near the bow of the ship, and it consists of a simple fire box filled with sand and stones to contain the flames. Cooking in this heat is like working inside an oven, but the crew still needs to eat, so Garsha grimly continues preparing the midday meal while cursing the weather, the ship, and probably Columbus himself. Historians still argue whether Columbus's crew was unusually skilled or simply typical of Spanish sailors of the time. What's clear is that they were capable of performing complex maintenance tasks under difficult conditions, using tools and techniques that required significant expertise. The fact that they managed to keep 3 ships seaworthy across thousands of miles of open ocean suggests a level of competence that's impressive by any standard. As you work on the sail repair, you notice that your hands are becoming more skilled at the unfamiliar tasks. When you started this journey, you were probably a landsman with little experience of shipboard life. Now, weeks into the voyage, you're developing the calluses and muscle memory that mark an experienced sailor. Your fingers know how to tie knots without thinking. Your body automatically adjusts to the ship's motion, and you're learning to read the subtle signs that indicate changes in weather or sea conditions. The midday work period is also when tensions tend to run highest among the crew. The combination of heat, exhaustion, and the constant stress of uncertainty creates an atmosphere where minor disagreements can escalate quickly. You overhear heated discussions about the ship's course, the quality of the food, and the promises Columbus made before departure. These conversations are conducted in lowered voices, but the underlying frustration is obvious to anyone paying attention. As the afternoon heat intensifies, so does the mood of discontent that's been simmering beneath the surface since you left the Canary Islands. You're coiling rope near the mainmast when you overhear a conversation between 2 sailors that makes your blood run cold. They're speaking in hushed tones, but their words carry clearly in the still air. How much longer can we trust him? And we've been sailing for weeks with no sign of land. The man speaking is Bartolome, a weathered sailor from Palos who's been to sea since childhood. He's normally one of the more level-headed crew members, but today his voice carries an edge of desperation. My wife is probably wondering if she's a widow, he mutters. Columbus promised us 33 days to the Indies. We've been out here over a month, and all we've seen is water. His companion, a younger man named Juan, nods grimly while checking to make sure no officers are within earshot. This is the reality of life aboard Columbus's ship that rarely makes it into the history books. The constant, gnawing fear that you're following a madman to your death. The crew was recruited with promises of wealth and glory, but as the days stretch into weeks with no sign of land, those promises are starting to sound like the fantasies of a delusional captain. You can see the doubt in the men's eyes, the way they glance toward the horizon with a mixture of hope and despair. Historical record shows that Columbus did indeed face serious mutiny threats during his first voyage. The crew's concerns were entirely rational. They were farther from land than any European expedition had ever traveled, with no guarantee that they would find anything but empty ocean. Columbus dealt with these concerns through a combination of false optimism, outright deception, and the occasional threat of harsh punishment for anyone who questioned his authority. You continue working while keeping your ears open to the conversations around you. The talk is becoming increasingly bold, with sailors openly discussing the possibility of forcing Columbus to turn back. One group near the bow is debating whether the ships have enough supplies to make it back to Spain, while another is questioning whether Columbus's navigation calculations are accurate. The most disturbing conversation involves speculation about what might happen if the crew decides to take matters into their own hands. The tension is made worse by the physical conditions aboard the ship. After weeks at sea, everything is starting to break down. The food is getting worse, the water is becoming more brackish, and the constant dampness has led to an outbreak of minor infections and skin conditions among the crew. You've developed a persistent cough that might be from the salt air or might be from sleeping in the damp air below deck. Either way, it's another reminder that this journey is taking a toll on everyone aboard. Columbus himself seems aware of the growing unrest, though he maintains his facade of confidence. You watch him during his afternoon rounds, noting how he makes a point of stopping to chat with small groups of sailors, always projecting optimism about their prospects. He points out every possible sign of nearby land, a piece of floating wood, a bird flying in an unfamiliar direction, a change in the water color that might indicate shallower depths. Whether these signs are genuine or manufactured doesn't matter. What matters is that Columbus is working hard to maintain morale. Here's a quirky historical detail that adds to the tension. Columbus promised a reward of 10,000 maravedis per year for life to the first person who spotted land. That's a fortune by the standards of the time, enough to live comfortably for decades. But some of the crew are starting to wonder if Columbus actually has the authority to make such promises, or if the Spanish crown will honor them even if land is discovered. You're potentially risking your life for a reward that might not even exist. The afternoon also brings the daily ritual of checking the ship's position and discussing the course for the following day. Columbus consults with his officers while the crew pretends to focus on their work, but everyone is actually listening to try to glean some information about their location and prospects. Today's discussion seems more heated than usual, with the pilot expressing concerns about their current heading and the limited food supplies remaining. You notice that Columbus has started making more dramatic gestures when discussing navigation, as if he's trying to convince himself as much as his officers. He speaks with absolute certainty about their location and the proximity of land, but his voice carries a slight tremor that suggests he's not as confident as he appears. The man who convinced the Spanish monarchs to finance this expedition is starting to show cracks in his armor of certainty. Historians still argue whether Columbus genuinely believed he would find land when he did, or if he was simply maintaining false confidence to prevent total despair among his crew. What's clear is that the psychological pressure on everyone aboard was enormous. You're trapped on a small ship with 40 other men, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, following a plan that's starting to look like elaborate suicide. As the afternoon wears on, the whispered conversations become more frequent and more bold. You hear fragments of planning, discussions about approaching Columbus as a group, demands for course changes, threats of what might happen if their concerns aren't addressed. The word mutiny isn't spoken aloud, but it hangs in the air like the smell of rotting fish. You're witnessing the build-up to one of the most famous confrontations in maritime history, and you're not sure which side you'll choose when the moment comes. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, the ship's cook rings the bell that signals the day's main meal. You abandon your afternoon tasks and join the queue forming near the cooking area, grateful for the break from both the heat and the increasingly tense conversations that have been circulating throughout the ship. The evening meal is the highlight of the day, not because the food is particularly good, but because it's the only time when the entire crew gathers together in something approaching a social atmosphere. Tonight's meal consists of a stew made from salt pork, dried beans, and whatever vegetables haven't completely spoiled during the voyage. The cook has added generous amounts of garlic and onion to mask the taste of the meat, which has developed a distinctly oceanic flavor that suggests it might be starting to turn. You receive your portion in a wooden bowl that's been carved from a single piece of oak, along with a chunk of hardtack that's been soaked in the stew's broth to make it edible. You find a spot on the deck near the mainmast, joining a circle of sailors who've formed their own informal dining group. These evening gatherings have become one of the few pleasures available during the long voyage, providing a chance to forget about the dangers and uncertainties of the journey for a little while. The conversation starts, as it always does, with complaints about the food, but gradually shifts to more interesting topics as the men begin to relax. Historical record shows that storytelling was an essential part of life aboard medieval ships, serving both as entertainment and as a way of preserving cultural knowledge. Sailors would share tales from their previous voyages, folk stories from their home regions, and elaborate fantasies about the wealth and adventures that awaited them at their destination. These stories served a crucial psychological function, helping to maintain morale and provide a sense of continuity with the world they'd left behind. Tonight's storyteller is Miguel, the experienced sailor who was your watch partner during the morning. He's regaling the group with a tale about his previous voyage to the coast of Africa, where he claims to have seen sea creatures the size of small islands and native people who could breathe underwater. The story is obviously exaggerated, but the crew listens with rapt attention, hungry for any entertainment that breaks the monotony of the voyage. "I swear by the Virgin Mary," Miguel says, gesturing dramatically with his wooden spoon. "The fish I saw off the Guinea coast were so large that birds were nesting on their backs. And the natives, they had gills like fish, right here on their necks." He demonstrates by pointing to his own throat, and several of the younger sailors lean forward with wide eyes. You know it's nonsense, but there's something comforting about listening to tales of wonders and mysteries, even if they're completely fabricated. The storytelling session also serves as a subtle form of information exchange. Sailors share news and gossip from their home ports, discuss rumors about other expeditions, and speculate about what they might find in the new lands Columbus promises to discover. Tonight's conversation includes a detailed discussion of the spices and gold that supposedly await discovery, with each man contributing his own version of the riches that will make them all wealthy beyond imagination. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Columbus's crew included several men who had experience with African voyages, and their stories about the wealth and exotic goods available in foreign lands helped fuel the expectations for this expedition. The problem was that these stories were often wildly exaggerated, creating unrealistic expectations that would later lead to disappointment and conflict when the reality of the New World failed to match the fantasies. As the evening progresses, the conversation turns to more personal topics. Antonio, the young sailor from Seville, talks about the girl he left behind and his plans to return home wealthy enough to marry her. Pedro shares memories of his mother's cooking, describing in loving detail the meals he plans to enjoy when he returns to Spain. These conversations are bittersweet, filled with longing for home and uncertainty about whether any of them will survive to see their families again. The mood shifts again when someone mentions the strange phenomena they've been observing during the voyage. Several sailors report seeing lights in the water at night, moving in patterns that don't match any known sea creatures. Others describe unusual cloud formations and changes in the wind patterns that might indicate the presence of land. The conversation becomes more animated as each man contributes his own observations and theories about what these signs might mean. Historians still argue whether the crew of Columbus's expedition was unusually superstitious or simply typical of medieval sailors. What's clear is that life at sea in the 15th century was filled with unexplained phenomena that sailors interpreted through the lens of their religious beliefs and cultural traditions. The line between observation and superstition was often blurred, with genuine navigation skills mixed with folk beliefs about sea monsters, mysterious islands, and divine intervention. As the meal concludes and the men begin to disperse to their evening duties, you notice that the storytelling session has served its purpose. The crew seems more relaxed, their faces showing traces of the camaraderie that develops among men sharing extreme circumstances. The tensions and fears that dominated the afternoon haven't disappeared, but they've been temporarily pushed aside by the simple pleasure of food, stories, and human companionship. The evening meal and storytelling ritual represents one of the few times during the day when the hierarchy of the ship is temporarily relaxed. Officers and common sailors share the same food and contribute to the same conversations, creating a sense of shared experience that helps maintain unit cohesion. Columbus himself sometimes joins these gatherings, though tonight he remains in his cabin, probably reviewing his charts and planning tomorrow's course. The sun hangs low on the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that would be breathtaking under normal circumstances. But you're not watching the sunset for its beauty. You're scanning the horizon with desperate intensity, hoping to spot the dark line of land that would signal the end of this nightmare voyage. This is the time of day when atmospheric conditions sometimes create mirages, when clouds on the horizon can look like distant mountains, and when every sailor aboard becomes an expert at spotting things that aren't actually there. You're standing at the bow of the ship, gripping the rail so tightly that your knuckles have turned white. The evening light creates optical illusions that make your heart race, shadows on the water that could be islands, cloud formations that might be mountains, changes in the water color that could indicate shallow coastal waters. You've learned to recognize these false alarms, but you can't help feeling a surge of hope each time something catches your eye. Columbus joins you at the bow, carrying his telescope, a primitive instrument that's barely more effective than the naked eye, but represents the cutting edge of navigational technology. He's been increasingly agitated as the day has progressed, and you can see the strain of maintaining confidence in the face of mounting crew discontent. He raises the telescope to his eye and studies the horizon with the intensity of a man whose life depends on finding land soon. There, Columbus says suddenly, pointing toward a dark shape on the horizon. Do you see it? That could be an island. You follow his gaze and see what he's talking about, a dark mass that stands out against the evening sky. Your heart starts pounding as you stare at the shape, trying to determine if it's really land or just another cloud formation. Other crew members have noticed Columbus's excitement and are gathering around, their faces showing the same desperate hope you feel. Historical record shows that Columbus and his crew reported numerous false sightings of land during their voyage, with some sailors claiming to see islands, mountains, and even fires on distant shores. These sightings were often the result of atmospheric conditions, optical illusions, or simply wishful thinking. But they served the important psychological function of maintaining hope during the darkest moments of the journey. For nearly an hour, you and the other sailors study the dark shape on the horizon, debating whether it's land or merely a cloud. The discussion becomes increasingly heated as some crew members insist they can see details, trees, beaches, even signs of human habitation. Others argue that it's clearly just a cloud formation, and that getting excited about such obvious mirages is a waste of emotional energy. Columbus himself seems uncertain, alternating between confident proclamations that land is near and worried glances at the crew's increasingly skeptical faces. As the minutes pass, the dark shape begins to dissipate in the changing light, revealing itself to be nothing more than a low-hanging cloud bank. The disappointment is palpable. You can feel it spreading through the gathered crew like a physical thing. Some men curse under their breath, while others simply turn away in disgust. This is perhaps the fourth or fifth false alarm in recent days, and each one takes a toll on morale that's already stretched to the breaking point. The sunset watch serves another practical purpose beyond land spotting. It's when the crew observes weather patterns and prepares for the night ahead. You help adjust the sails for the lighter evening winds, checking the rigging and ensuring that everything is secure for the overnight journey. The ship's motion changes as the wind patterns shift, and you can feel the Santa Maria settling into the gentle rhythm that will carry you through the darkness. Here's a quirky historical detail that adds to the atmosphere. Columbus's crew believed that the evening hours were when sea monsters were most active. Medieval sailors had elaborate theories about nocturnal sea creatures that rose from the depths to prey on unwary ships, and the transition from day to night was considered a particularly dangerous time. whether you believe in sea monsters or not. The evening watch has an undeniably eerie quality, as familiar daytime sounds give way to the mysterious noises of the night ocean. As the last light fades from the western sky, you notice that the water around the ship has taken on a phosphorescent quality, glowing faintly where the hull cuts through the waves. This natural phenomenon, caused by microscopic marine organisms, creates an otherworldly effect that both fascinates and unnerves the crew. Some sailors interpret the glowing water as a good omen, while others see it as evidence of supernatural forces at work beneath the surface. The evening ritual concludes with Columbus making his daily address to the crew, summarizing the day's progress and outlining plans for the following day. Tonight's speech is more subdued than usual, perhaps because of the false alarm earlier, but Columbus still maintains his characteristic optimism. He speaks about the favorable winds, the positive signs they've observed, and his continued confidence that land is near. You listen to his words while watching the expressions of the crew, noting the mixture of hope and skepticism on their faces. Columbus's evening addresses serve multiple functions. They provide information about the ship's status, maintain the illusion of orderly progress toward a known destination, and give the crew a sense of participation in the expedition's larger purpose. But tonight's speech feels different. There's an edge of desperation in Columbus's voice that suggests he's as worried about the situation as anyone else aboard. Historians still argue whether Columbus's repeated false alarms were genuine mistakes or deliberate attempts to maintain crew morale. The truth is probably a combination of both. Columbus was working with limited information and primitive instruments, but he also understood the psychological importance of maintaining hope among his men. Every false sighting was both a disappointment and a reminder that land could appear at any moment. As the evening watch concludes and the crew prepares for the night shift, you take one last look at the horizon, now barely visible in the fading light. Tomorrow will bring another day of sailing into the unknown, another 24 hours of uncertainty and false hopes. But tonight, as you prepare to go below deck for a few hours of rest, you allow yourself to imagine that tomorrow might be different, that tomorrow might be the day when the dark shape on the horizon turns out to be real land instead of another disappointing cloud. Darkness falls over the Atlantic like a heavy curtain, transforming the familiar world of the ship into something alien and mysterious. You're assigned to the first night watch, which means you'll be on duty until midnight, while most of the crew tries to sleep below deck. The temperature has dropped considerably with the sun's departure, and you pull your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders as you take your position at the ship's rail. The night watch is simultaneously the most peaceful and most terrifying part of the daily routine. Peaceful because the ship settles into a gentle rhythm as it cuts through the dark water, with only the sound of wind in the rigging and waves against the hull to break the silence. Terrifying because the darkness hides everything. You can't see more than a few feet beyond the ship's edge, and your imagination fills the invisible ocean with every monster and danger that medieval sailors ever dreamed up. Your watch partner tonight is Vicent, a quiet man from Cordoba who's been remarkably steady throughout the voyage. He's one of the few crew members who doesn't seem to be affected by the growing tension aboard the ship, maintaining his duties with the same methodical precision he's shown since departure. You're grateful for his company, especially since his calm demeanor helps counteract your own growing anxiety about the night ahead. The ship's lanterns provide the only light in the vast darkness, creating small pools of yellow illumination that make the surrounding blackness seem even more impenetrable. Columbus has ordered that the lanterns be kept burning throughout the night, both for safety and as a signal to the other two ships in the fleet. You can see the distant lights of the Nina and the Pinta, tiny points of light that represent the only other human presence in this vast emptiness. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Columbus's fleet maintained visual contact throughout most of the voyage, using a system of lantern signals and predetermined courses. The ships would spread out during the day to increase their chances of spotting land, then converge at night for mutual protection and navigation coordination. This required precise timing and seamanship, especially considering that they had no reliable way to measure time except by observing the stars and using primitive hourglasses. The night watch duties are straightforward in theory, but challenging in practice. You're responsible for monitoring the ship's course, watching for changes in weather conditions, and most importantly, staying alert for any signs of danger. This could include other ships, floating debris, changes in water color that might indicate shallow areas, or the increasingly unlikely possibility of land. The problem is that darkness makes it nearly impossible to see any of these things until they're dangerously close. You spend much of your watch time listening rather than looking, trying to identify the various sounds that make up the ship's nighttime symphony. There's the constant creaking of the hull as it flexes with the waves, the rhythmic slapping of water against the sides, and the whispered conversations of the wind through the rigging. Occasionally, you hear more unusual sounds, splashing that might be dolphins, or might be something else entirely, distant calls that could be seabirds, or could be something more mysterious. The stars provide the only reliable navigation reference during the night hours, and you've learned to identify the major constellations that Columbus and his officers use for positioning. The North Star hangs steadily above the horizon, providing a constant reference point that helps maintain the ship's westward course. Other stars wheel slowly across the sky, marking the passage of time in an environment where traditional timekeeping methods are nearly useless. Historians still argue whether Columbus's night navigation was particularly skilled or simply adequate for the time period. What's clear is that maintaining course during the dark hours required considerable expertise and constant attention. The combination of star navigation, dead reckoning, and pure seamanship that kept the fleet together and on course represents a remarkable achievement in medieval navigation. The psychological challenges of the night watch are as difficult as the technical ones. The darkness amplifies every fear and uncertainty that's been building during the voyage, making it impossible to ignore the reality of your situation. You're hundreds of miles from the nearest land, following a man whose navigation skills are questionable, with no guarantee that you'll ever see home again. These thoughts, easily pushed aside during the busy daylight hours, become overwhelming in the quiet darkness. You find yourself thinking about home more intensely during the night watch than at any other time. The darkness seems to dissolve the barriers between past and present, making memories of your previous life more vivid and immediate. You remember specific meals, conversations with friends, the feeling of solid ground beneath your feet. These memories are both comforting and painful, reminding you of everything you've left behind for this uncertain adventure. The night watch also provides opportunities for private conversations that would be impossible during the busy daylight hours. Vicent shares his own doubts about the voyage, speaking in whispers that won't carry to the other crew members. He tells you about his wife and children back in Cordoba, about the financial pressures that led him to sign up for this expedition, and about his growing fears that none of them will survive to return home. These conversations create a sense of intimacy and trust that helps maintain sanity in an increasingly insane situation. As your watch progresses toward midnight, you notice that the ship's motion has changed slightly. The wind has shifted, and the waves are coming from a different direction, creating a more complex pattern of movement that requires constant attention to maintain balance. You and Vicent work together to adjust the sails, a task that's considerably more difficult in the darkness, but essential for maintaining the ship's course and speed. The ship's bell tolls midnight, its bronze voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. You're now in the deepest part of the night watch, when the boundary between reality and nightmare becomes thin as parchment. The ocean around you seems to pulse with an otherworldly life, and every sound carries the potential for terror. This is the hour when medieval sailors believed the sea gave up its dead, when monsters rose from the depths to claim unwary vessels, and when the devil himself was said to walk the waves. You're standing at the port rail, staring into water so dark it might as well be the entrance to hell itself. The phosphorescent wake behind the ship creates the only visible disturbance in the black mirror of the sea, a ghostly trail that seems to glow with its own inner light. But tonight, there are other lights in the water, strange, pulsing illuminations that appear and disappear beneath the surface, following no pattern you can understand. Vicent grabs your arm suddenly, his fingers digging into your flesh through the wool of your cloak. "Do you see that?" he whispers, his voice tight with fear. You follow his gaze and see what's captured his attention, a dark shape moving parallel to the ship, just beneath the surface of the water. It's large, larger than any fish you've ever seen, and it's keeping pace with the Santa Maria's progress through the waves. The shape moves with a fluid grace that's both beautiful and terrifying, occasionally breaking the surface just enough to create a disturbance in the water. You catch glimpses of what might be scales, or might be something else entirely. The darkness makes it impossible to distinguish between reality and imagination. Other crew members on night watch have noticed the phenomenon, and you can hear urgent whispers spreading across the deck as word of the sighting spreads. Historical records from Columbus's voyage include numerous references to strange sea creatures encountered during the Atlantic crossing. Some of these were probably whales, dolphins, or other known marine life that appeared unfamiliar to sailors who had never ventured far from European coasts. Others may have been genuine encounters with species that were unknown to medieval science. And some were almost certainly the products of exhausted minds and overactive imaginations pushed to their limits by the stress of the voyage. The creature, or whatever it is, continues to follow the ship for nearly an hour, occasionally surfacing just enough to reveal glimpses of its true size. Your estimates range from 30 to 60 feet in length, making it easily the largest living thing you've ever encountered. Some of the crew members are convinced it's a whale, while others insist it's something more sinister, a sea serpent, or dragon drawn by the ship's passage through its territory. Columbus himself emerges from his cabin to observe the phenomenon, carrying a lantern that casts dancing shadows across his worried face. He studies the creature with the same intensity he brings to navigation, trying to determine whether it represents a threat to the ship or merely a curious encounter with the ocean's mysteries. "It's following our course," he murmurs, more to himself than to anyone else. That's unusual behavior for a whale. The psychological impact of the sighting is immediate and profound. Sailors who were already on edge from weeks of uncertainty now have a tangible focus for their fears. Conversations buzz with speculation about the creature's intentions, its possible connection to the strange lights in the water, and what its presence might mean for the expedition's chances of success. Some crew members interpret it as a bad omen, while others see it as a guardian spirit guiding them toward their destination. There's a quirky historical detail that adds to the atmosphere. Medieval sailors believed that certain sea creatures were attracted to ships carrying holy relics or men on sacred missions. Columbus's expedition was officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church and blessed by priests before departure, leading some crew members to theorize that the creature's presence is evidence of divine protection. Whether this theory provides comfort or additional anxiety depends on your personal relationship with religious faith. The creature's behavior becomes increasingly strange as the night progresses. It begins to circle the ship in wide arcs, sometimes disappearing completely before reappearing on the opposite side. During one particularly dramatic moment, it surfaces directly alongside the ship, close enough that you can see what appears to be a massive eye reflecting the lantern light. The sight is so startling that several crew members step back from the rail, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. You find yourself torn between scientific curiosity and primal fear. Part of you wants to study the creature more closely, to understand its behavior, and perhaps solve the mystery of its identity. But another part of you recognizes that some mysteries are better left unsolved, especially when you're hundreds of miles from land, with no means of escape if things go wrong. The creature represents everything unknown and potentially dangerous about this voyage into uncharted waters. As the hours pass, other strange phenomena begin to manifest in the water around the ship. patches of phosphorescence appear and disappear in patterns that seem almost deliberate, creating the illusion of underwater cities or massive schools of glowing fish. The sound of the waves changes, taking on harmonics that remind you of distant music or voices calling across the water. These sensory distortions make it increasingly difficult to distinguish between real observations and hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and stress. Historians still argue whether the crew of Columbus's expedition encountered genuinely unknown species during their Atlantic crossing, or whether their reports of sea monsters and strange phenomena were simply the result of inexperienced sailors encountering familiar marine life in an unfamiliar environment. What's undeniable is that these encounters had a profound psychological impact on the crew, adding another layer of uncertainty and fear to an already stressful situation. The creature finally disappears sometime after 2 in the morning, vanishing into the depths as suddenly as it appeared. The crew members on night watch continue to scan the water for signs of its return, but the ocean has returned to its normal patterns of darkness and phosphorescent wake. Whether the creature was real or imagined, whether it was a whale or something more exotic, becomes a topic of heated discussion that will continue for the remainder of the voyage. The darkest hour before dawn finds you in a contemplative mood, leaning against the ship's rail as the stars begin their slow fade toward morning. Your night watch is nearly over, and the strange encounter with the sea creature has left you with a profound sense of how little you understand about the world beyond the familiar coasts of Europe. The ocean stretches endlessly in all directions, hiding mysteries that medieval science can't explain and dangers that no amount of preparation can anticipate. You're thinking about the chain of decisions that brought you to this moment, the economic pressures that made Columbus's promises seem attractive, the mixture of ambition and desperation that convinced you to sign on for this voyage into the unknown. Back in Spain, the expedition seemed like a reasonable gamble. A few months at sea in exchange for a share of the wealth that Columbus promised to discover. Now, weeks into the journey with no land in sight, the gamble feels more like a death sentence. The pre-dawn hours are when the human mind turns inward, when the distractions of daily routine give way to deeper questions about purpose, mortality, and the choices that define a life. You find yourself wondering if your family back home has given you up for dead, if they're already mourning your loss while you're still breathing. The possibility that you might never see them again is no longer abstract. It's a real prospect that grows more likely with each passing day. Your watch partner Vicent has been unusually quiet during this shift, lost in his own thoughts as he stares at the horizon. When he finally speaks, his voice carries the weight of a man who's been wrestling with profound questions. "Do you think we're fools?" he asks. "Following a man who might be leading us to our deaths based on calculations that could be completely wrong." The question hangs in the air between you, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Historical record shows that Columbus's crew was recruited from the margins of Spanish society, sailors, adventurers, and desperate men who had few other options for improving their circumstances. Many were drawn by the promise of wealth and status that would be impossible to achieve through conventional means. Others were fleeing debts, legal troubles, or personal failures that made the risk of death at sea seem preferable to their current situations. In other words, you're surrounded by men who had compelling reasons to take desperate chances. You think about the world you've left behind, not just the people, but the entire universe of certainty and predictability that defined your previous life. Back in Spain, you knew where you were when you woke up each morning, what food would be available, which roads led to which destinations. The physical and social geography of your world was mapped and understood, providing a framework for making reasonable decisions about the future. Here, in the middle of the Atlantic, all of that certainty has been stripped away. You don't know where you are, where you're going, or whether you'll survive to see another sunrise. The familiar rules of cause and effect have been suspended, replaced by a reality where unknown creatures emerge from the depths, and experienced navigators make calculations based on incomplete information. You're living in a world where anything is possible, which is both terrifying and strangely liberating. The pre-dawn reflections also turn to questions of faith and divine providence. Columbus has repeatedly claimed that God is guiding this expedition, that the discovery of new lands will serve the greater purpose of spreading Christianity and fulfilling biblical prophecies. Some crew members find comfort in these religious explanations, while others question whether a loving God would subject faithful believers to such extreme hardships and uncertainties. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Columbus's personal writings reveal a man who genuinely believed he was fulfilling a divine mission, not just pursuing personal wealth and glory. His later journals include extensive references to biblical prophecies and his conviction that the discovery of new lands was part of God's plan for the salvation of humanity. Whether this faith was genuine or a convenient rationalization for his ambitions is a question that historians still debate. As the first hints of dawn begin to appear on the eastern horizon, you realize that the night watch has changed you in some fundamental way. The combination of exhaustion, fear, and profound uncertainty has stripped away the comfortable illusions that normally protect people from confronting the basic realities of existence. You're more aware of your own mortality, more appreciative of simple pleasures like food and shelter, and more conscious of the thin line that separates civilization from chaos. The approaching dawn also brings a return to the routines and responsibilities that will fill the coming day. Soon, the ship will be bustling with activity as the crew begins another day of sailing toward an uncertain destination. The night's reflections will be pushed aside by the immediate demands of navigation, maintenance, and survival. But the questions raised during these quiet hours will continue to simmer beneath the surface, shaping your understanding of the journey and your place in the larger story of exploration and discovery. Historians still argue whether the crew of Columbus's expedition was unusually introspective or simply typical of people placed in extreme circumstances. What's clear is that the voyage forced ordinary men to confront extraordinary questions about faith, purpose, and the nature of reality itself. The The pre-dawn hours provided a space for these contemplations, a time when the usual distractions fell away and deeper truths could emerge. As your night watch draws to close, you take one last look at the horizon, now beginning to lighten with the promise of another day. The ocean that seemed so threatening in the darkness now appears almost peaceful, its surface reflecting the soft colors of the approaching sunrise. Whether today will bring the discovery of land or another day of sailing into the unknown remains to be seen, but you face the uncertainty with a deeper understanding of yourself and your place in this remarkable journey. The dawn sky carries an ominous quality that every experienced sailor learns to recognize, a particular color and texture of clouds that speaks of weather changes ahead. You notice it first as a subtle shift in the light, the way the eastern horizon seems muted and gray instead of the clear gold you've grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Columbus emerges from his cabin earlier than usual, studying the sky with the intensity of a man who's learned to read nature's warning signs through decades of experience at sea. "We're going to have weather," announces the ship's pilot, Sancho Ruiz, as he joins Columbus at the stern. The two men examine the clouds through Columbus's primitive telescope, pointing out formations and discussing wind patterns in the technical language of professional sailors. Their conversation is conducted in low tones, but you can hear enough to understand that they're concerned about the possibility of a significant storm developing sometime during the day. The prospect of a storm at sea is terrifying under the best of circumstances, but your situation makes it potentially catastrophic. The Santa Maria and her companion ships are hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with no hope of finding shelter if the weather turns violent. The ships are sturdy enough to survive normal Atlantic storms, but they're also carrying supplies and equipment that could shift dangerously in heavy seas. And the crew is already weakened by weeks of poor food and limited fresh water. You join the other sailors in the storm preparation routine, a series of tasks designed to secure everything that could become dangerous projectiles if the ship starts rolling violently. Loose rope is coiled and lashed down. Barrels are double-checked to ensure they won't break free from their restraints, and the ship's few cannons are secured with additional ropes and blocks. Every piece of equipment, from cooking pots to navigation instruments, receives attention from crew members who understand that a loose object in a storm can kill as quickly as lightning. The historical record shows that Columbus's fleet encountered several significant storms during their Atlantic crossing, with at least one severe enough to threaten the expedition's survival. Medieval ships were remarkably seaworthy, considering their construction methods, but they were also vulnerable to the kind of extreme weather that the Atlantic Ocean could generate without warning. The crew's survival depended on their ability to prepare for these emergencies and work together under the most difficult conditions imaginable. As the morning progresses, the signs of approaching bad weather become more obvious. The wind begins to shift directions more frequently, creating confused sea conditions that make the ship's motion more erratic and uncomfortable. The barometric pressure, though you don't have instruments to measure it, seems to be dropping, creating a sense of heaviness in the air that makes breathing more difficult. Several crew members complain of headaches and joint pain, classic symptoms of changing weather patterns. The storm preparation also involves adjusting the ship's sail configuration to handle the stronger winds that are expected. The largest sails are partially furled and secured with additional lines, reducing the ship's speed, but improving its stability and control. The crew works with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated by years of experience, and the knowledge that their lives depend on getting these preparations right. Columbus gathers the crew for a brief address about the approaching weather, striking his usual balance between honesty about the dangers and confidence in their ability to handle the situation. "We've weathered storms before," he tells the assembled sailors, "and we'll weather this one too. But I need every man to do his duty and follow orders without question. In a storm, hesitation can kill us all." His words are meant to be reassuring, but they also carry an undertone of threat that reminds everyone of the harsh discipline that keeps ships functioning in crisis situations. Here's a quirky historical detail that adds to the drama. Columbus's crew included several men who had never experienced a major storm at sea, having spent their previous sailing careers in the relatively calm Mediterranean. The Atlantic Ocean's weather patterns were unfamiliar territory for these sailors, adding an extra layer of uncertainty to an already dangerous situation. You might be one of these inexperienced crew members facing your first major storm hundreds of miles from land. The psychological preparation for a storm is as important as the physical preparations. You can see the fear in the faces of your fellow sailors, the way they check and recheck their equipment, the nervous conversations about family back home, and the possibility of not surviving the coming ordeal. Some crew members become more religious during these preparations, spending extra time in prayer and making promises to God in exchange for divine protection. As the day progresses, the weather continues to deteriorate. The wind becomes more consistent in its strength, but more variable in its direction, creating conditions that require constant attention from the helmsman and frequent adjustments to the sail configuration. The waves begin to build in size and frequency, creating a more aggressive motion that makes it difficult to maintain footing on the deck. The storm preparation routine serves multiple purposes beyond simple safety. It gives the crew something constructive to focus on instead of dwelling on their fears. It reinforces the ship's chain of command at a time when discipline is crucial, and it demonstrates Columbus's competence as a leader in crisis situations. Whether the crew's confidence in his abilities is justified remains to be seen, but the preparation process itself helps maintain morale and unit cohesion. Historians still argue whether Columbus was particularly skilled at storm management or simply lucky enough to avoid the worst weather during his Atlantic crossings. What's clear is that his crew's survival depended on their ability to work together under extreme conditions, following complex procedures while dealing with fear, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. storm preparation represents both the crew's competence and their vulnerability, demonstrating the thin line between survival and disaster that defined life at sea in the medieval period. As the preparations conclude and the crew settles into the routine of storm sailing, you realize that the next several hours will test everything you've learned about seamanship, courage, and survival. The approaching storm represents both a threat and an opportunity, a threat to your physical survival, but also an opportunity to prove your worth as a sailor and contribute to one of history's most significant voyages of discovery. The storm passes by late afternoon, leaving behind calmer seas and a crew exhausted from hours of battling wind and waves. You've survived your first major Atlantic storm, though the experience has left you shaken and more aware than ever of how precarious your situation really is. The ship sustained minor damage, a torn sail, some loose rigging, and a few barrels that broke free despite the crew's best efforts, but nothing that threatens the expedition's continuation. As evening approaches, you find yourself assigned to the first sleep rotation, a luxury that feels almost decadent after the intensity of the storm. The crew sleeps in shifts, with half the men resting while the others maintain the ship's operation. Your sleeping area is a narrow space between decks, barely tall enough to sit upright, where hammocks are slung in rows that maximize the use of available space. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and the ever-present scent of the ship's bilge. You settle into your hammock, a crude affair made from canvas and rope that's surprisingly comfortable compared to sleeping on the hard deck planks. The ship's motion, which seemed threatening during the storm, now feels almost soothing as it rocks you with a gentle, rhythmic movement. The sound of waves against the hull and wind in the rigging creates a natural lullaby that helps counteract the various aches and pains that have accumulated during the day's activities. Sleep comes quickly, but it's filled with dreams that transport you far from the Atlantic Ocean. You dream of home, not the Spain you left behind, but a more idealized version where the food is always fresh, the beds are always dry, and the ground never moves beneath your feet. In your dreams, you're sitting at a table with your family, sharing a meal of roasted meat and fresh bread, telling stories about your adventure while knowing that you're safe and that the dangers are behind you. Historical record suggests that homesickness was a constant problem for the crew of Columbus's expedition. Many of the sailors had never been away from their home ports for more than a few weeks, and the extended nature of the Atlantic crossing created unprecedented psychological stress. Dreams of home served as both comfort and torment, providing temporary escape from the harsh realities of life at sea, while also emphasizing everything the crew had left behind. Your dream shifts to memories of your departure from Spain, but now filtered through the lens of experience and nostalgia. You remember the excitement and anticipation you felt when signing on for the expedition, the promises of wealth and adventure that seemed so compelling at the time. In your dream, you're trying to warn your younger self about the realities of the voyage, the fear, the uncertainty, the constant threat of death. But your younger self can't hear the warnings, too caught up in dreams of gold and glory. The dream narrative becomes more complex as your sleeping mind processes the day's experiences. You're sailing through a storm that transforms into a battle with sea monsters, then shifts into a banquet where Columbus is serving dishes made from exotic spices and fruits that don't exist in European markets. The dream logic makes perfect sense while you're experiencing it, but you're also dimly aware that none of it is real, that you're still sleeping in a hammock on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Here's a fascinating historical detail. Medieval sailors often reported remarkably vivid dreams during long voyages, a phenomenon that modern sleep researchers attribute to the combination of physical exhaustion, nutritional deficiencies, and psychological stress. The constant motion of the ship may have also affected normal sleep patterns, creating conditions that enhanced dream recall and intensity. Your dreams are both a product of your individual psychology and a shared experience with your fellow crew members. As the night progresses, your dreams become more fragmented and surreal. You're walking through familiar streets that keep changing into unfamiliar landscapes, talking to people who shift between the faces of family members and fellow sailors. The boundary between memory and fantasy dissolves, creating a narrative that's both deeply personal and completely impossible. You're simultaneously the person who left Spain weeks ago and the person who's been transformed by the voyage's experiences. The dreams also reflect the fundamental uncertainty about the expedition's outcome. In some dream sequences, you're returning home wealthy and successful, celebrated as a hero who participated in the discovery of new lands. In others, you're lost at sea, your family never knowing what happened to you. These alternate futures play out in your sleeping mind with equal vividness, reflecting the real possibility that either outcome could become reality. Historians still argue whether the psychological stress of Columbus's voyage was typical for medieval expeditions or unusually severe due to the unprecedented nature of the Atlantic crossing. What's clear is that the crew's mental health was as important as their physical health for the expedition's success. Dreams provided a crucial outlet for processing fears, hopes, and memories that couldn't be adequately addressed during the waking hours. As dawn approaches and your sleep period draws to close, your dreams begin to fade, leaving behind fragments of emotion and imagery that will color your waking thoughts. The transition from sleep to consciousness is gradual, marked by increasing awareness of the ship's motion, the sounds of the crew beginning their morning routine, and the physical discomfort of sleeping in a hammock for several hours. You wake to find yourself changed in some subtle way by the night's rest and dreams. The terrors of the storm have been processed and integrated into your understanding of the voyage's dangers. The homesickness has been acknowledged and partially soothed by the dream contact with family and familiar places. You're still hundreds of miles from land, still following Columbus into the unknown, but you're also more resilient and better prepared for whatever the day might bring. The dreams of home will continue throughout the remainder of the voyage, providing both comfort and motivation for the crew's continued efforts. They serve as a reminder of what you're fighting to return to, a source of strength during the darkest moments of the journey. Whether you'll ever see the reality behind those dreams remains unknown, but the dreams themselves become part of the story, part of the experience that transforms ordinary sailors into participants in one of history's most significant voyages of discovery. As you prepare to leave your hammock and begin another day aboard Columbus's ship, you carry with you the memory of the dreams and the knowledge that, regardless of what the future holds, you've already traveled farther from home than most people ever will. The dreams provide a bridge between the person you were and the person you're becoming, between the familiar world of medieval Europe and the unknown world that awaits discovery beyond the western horizon. The soft murmur of waves against the hull continues its ancient rhythm, a lullaby that has sung countless sailors to sleep across the centuries. Your breathing deepens, your muscles relax, and consciousness drifts away like morning mist over calm water. The dreams fade into the deeper sleep of exhaustion, carrying you through the peaceful hours before dawn, when the cycle will begin again with another day of sailing toward the unknown. In these final moments of rest, there's only the gentle rocking of the ship, the whispered conversations of the sea and wind, and the quiet promise that morning will bring new possibilities, new hopes, and perhaps, finally, the sight of land on the distant horizon.